Now, the problem is that I have not heard anybody, and I have to say that includes Professor Richard Wolff. I have not heard anybody give a proper definition to what socialism is, because we live under this false dichotomy between socialism and capitalism, and we believe that countries like the United States and Britain and Western Europe, Japan, that these are capitalist countries, and that socialist countries are places like China, Venezuela, I don't know, Vietnam, Russia, places like that. That's not true. In the Western, quote unquote, capitalist countries, most of the nations are very close to 50% participation of the government in the GDP. So governments account for pretty much half the GDP. In France, it's more. It's close to 57%. In the United States, the number has been always 30%, but for decades, they never move it. But we know that the government's share in the GDP keeps growing. In Britain, it's close to 50%. I think in Europe, I don't know what it is, but it's also inching close to half. So, to be talking about free market capitalism, where half of your GDP is the government, is simply false. Now, the real difference, I would have to talk about a concept that is not being taught in economics, but which is absolutely central to economics, which is called deflationary gap. I studied economics in university. Nobody ever mentioned it. I learned that later, and I had to learn it from forbidden books, books that are not allowed to be sold. Or at least they were not allowed to be sold some years ago. One of them is the Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Because of the deflationary gap, this concept, which I'll just skip over it. If people are interested, I have an article about it on my Substack. Basically, the government has to step in to bolster the purchasing power in an economic system. Because without the government stepping in, the purchasing power keeps systematically going down for two reasons, two main reasons. One is that people don't spend all the money that they make every year. They set aside a percentage, which is probably 5-10%. They set it aside as savings. So that purchasing power is removed from the market. And then the second large chunk that's being systematically removed from the market is repayment of debts, because money all enters into circulation as debt. When you repay your debt, you extinguish that money. So all the debts that are repaid is the money that disappears. So as money is withdrawn from circulation through savings and repayment of debts, that reduces the whole economy's purchasing power. And so for all the participants in the economies, the entrepreneurs and firms and the government, to be able to sell their goods and services at the prices that they're asking, it becomes impossible. So they have to lower the prices. So the system enters into price deflation. And price deflation has a tendency to be a self-reinforcing process. So you enter into this, what the economists colloquially call deflationary death spiral. And then the government, the economy only stabilizes when you get to depression level of activity, meaning an economy basically produces the bare necessities, food, apparel, building materials to repair roofs and stuff like that. And that's that it stabilizes at that level. So to keep the economy always growing, which is some kind of an imperative that all governments unquestioningly pursue, you have to constantly inject new purchasing power into the system. Tax and spend is not enough, because if government just tax people and then takes those taxes and spends it in the economy, you didn't create new purchasing power. You merely transferred it from people who earned it to the government, but it's the same amount of money. It doesn't increase the systems, it doesn't grow the system. So the government has to raise debt. And this is why, if you look at the debts of the American government, the British government, Italian, German, French, Japanese, every government that has this monetary system in operation, their debt levels are constantly going higher and higher and higher. And along with the deficits, they have to borrow money, meaning they have to spend more than they collect in taxes. So you'll see the deficit spending is also always going up and up and up and up. Okay, so this is why the government participation in the economy keeps growing, and it's a mathematical certainty given the monetary system that we have. So this is true of what we call socialist governments, and it's equally true about what we call the capitalist governments. But I'll tell you what the difference is. Those countries that we call socialist, the government spending largely flows bottom up, meaning the government spends on social programs, generous pension plans, free education, free healthcare, maintaining the infrastructure in the system, and so on. The way government spend in capitalist systems is usually top down, meaning the government largesse is distributed to large corporations and banks. It's the big corporations that get the handouts and the subsidies. And everybody thinks that's great because, if General Electric gets a subsidy, if government media gets subsidies, that's great. Big agriculture, big banks, big oil, they get hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies every year. And everybody thinks that's great because that's capitalism. But if you give money to ordinary people, to unemployed, to you provide free education and free healthcare and so on, everybody thinks that's horrible, that shouldn't be done. But the effect of this is that in socialist, quote unquote, socialist systems, people have money to spend and they decide how to spend it. Meaning, they can spend it at a restaurant, they can go buy clothes. So there's space, there's room, and there's purchasing power available for small and medium-sized businesses to survive. In quote-unquote capitalist systems, money goes to General Electric and to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Monsanto and companies like this, huge healthcare corporations and so on. People don't have any money. It's the big corporations that have money. And then they use that money to lobby the government. The ultimate effect of that is actually fascism, because you're creating incentives for collusion between large corporations and government. And then the money that you give to the military-industrial complex, that tends to fuel the forever wars. So you don't see very many socialist countries that are constantly at war, left and right. But you see a lot of capitalist countries that are constantly at war, primarily countries like the United States, Britain, and France. And so I think a better definition of the differences between what we think is socialism and what we think is capitalism is very essential to even get anywhere inside this debate, because at the moment there is no debate almost. People who hate capitalism do so on ideological grounds. People who hate socialism also do so on ideological grounds. So you have two camps that aren't even capable of talking to each other than hurling insults. And I have, I'm a former hedge fund manager. I have a lot of friends who are, what they would call card-carrying capitalists. And they have nothing but contempt and insults for anybody who has anything good to say about socialism. And I, sometimes in these gatherings, they call me a communist. I'm not a communist. I grew up in communism. I was reared through my education system on Marxism. I don't buy Marxism. I don't support Marxism. But it's not so much ideology. It's the way the system operates. So you need an unideological systems engineering framework of mind to be able to understand what the society's problem is.
Yeah. I think. Do you know who made the two sides talking to each other? China.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But still we don't have good understanding. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, somebody organized this big debate about communism versus capitalism, or socialism versus capitalism. And they invited the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, arguing the socialist camp, and Jordan Peterson arguing for capitalist camp. Neither one of them had any clue what they were talking about. It was again, they were not hurling insults at each other, but it was again all ideological drivel. They didn't move 1 inch closer to one another in understanding of what the real problem is.